Greetings and welcome from the League of Women Voters of Portland. My name is Debbie Kay. I'm the League President. I really hope that you are all managing this COVID pandemic as best possible. I'm glad to welcome you this evening. The League is dedicated to making democracy work. Our core belief is that democracy functions best when voters are informed about issues and engaged in their communities. For that reason, we present these programs to give our Portland and Multnomah County community neighbors the opportunity to think about the issues that impact our lives and well-being. The League's mission is empowering voters and defending democracy. I am very proud of the remarkable quantity of nonpartisan information that we researched and presented for voters in this past election. And now, following this extremely contentious and important election, we wanted to explore its implications locally and nationally. So we are pleased to have you join our November program featuring 3 speakers with different kinds of expertise who will help us analyze and consider what's next. Our media partner, Metro East Community Media, records our civic education and voter information panels and presentations and broadcasts them on community media channels. Please invite your friends and family to watch this program, available through our website, lwvpdx.org, starting on November 20. We appreciate the support of the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation, the Weiss Foundation, and the League of Women Voters of Portland Education Fund. We thank our speakers, the moderator, and the League volunteers who donate their time and expertise in bringing these programs to you. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, League member, former board member, and my esteemed friend, James Offsing. James also leads our League's criminal justice group and is involved in the police accountability study as well. He's serving a 4-year term representing Multnomah County taxpayers as a tax supervising and conservation commissioner appointed by the governor. James works at Oregon Health and Science University in the Information Technology Division. James, I'm turning the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And thank you everyone for joining us here tonight. We're looking forward to the insights from our 3 experienced political analysts on the 2020 results at the local, state, regional, and national levels. We're going to hear about who voted, what influenced voting and outcomes, and the implications for our community and democracy. First to speak will be John Horvick. John will give his unique insights into local, regional, and state elections. John is Director for Client Relations and Political Research at DHM Research, a nonpartisan, independent public opinion research firm. John regularly speaks on issues of community, policy, and governance to public officials and governing bodies, and is a political analyst for Oregon Public Broadcasting and Fox 12 News. Next, we have Dr. Priscilla Southwell, a University of Oregon professor with considerable experience in US, European, and Oregon politics, elections, voting by mail, voter turnout, and political behavior. Previously, she headed the Department of Political Science and served as the university's Associate Dean of Social Sciences. Next, we will have Barbara Dudley. Barbara is a LWV PDX League member and senior fellow at Portland State University's Center for Public Service. Barbara appears regularly on OPB's Think Out Loud at Friday's News Roundtable, and at Friday's News Roundtable. Barbara is also a senior policy advisor for the Oregon Working Families Party and a partner in Bethel Heights Vineyard. She formerly served as president and executive director of the National Lawyers Guild, executive director of Greenpeace USA, and the National AFL-CIO's assistant director for strategic campaigns. Each of our speakers will have 10 minutes to speak before we open up the programs for your questions. First up, we'll have John Horvick. John, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Oh, thank you so much, James and Debbie and the League. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I appreciate all the good work that you do, not just in this election, but all the elections and for the community. I'm a pollster. Pollsters deal with numbers, and so the best way to talk about numbers is to show some charts and graphs. And so I'm going to share my screen here because I do want to Do you want to show some numbers? All right, see if I can get this going. All right, so one of the questions that pollsters love to ask is, all things considered, is the community or the state or the country, are things heading in the right direction, or are they off on the wrong track? It's a question we ask a lot. I have a lot of sort of benchmark that I could talk about if you're interested in Q&A, but what I want to do here is just give you some sort of sense of how the voters were feeling in the Portland metro region. I'm really going to focus on the local races, the mayor's race, some regional stuff, and then save so the bigger things for other panelists in Q&A. But in the Portland metro region, in the city of Portland, in October, in a survey that we did in partnership with OPB, we found that 53% of region residents thought that the community was heading was off on the wrong track, and that specifically voters in the city of Portland thought that the city was off on the wrong track. For context, these are really bad numbers. The statewide numbers right now are also quite low, but if we look historically, wrong track numbers for the state typically are in the mid-30s. For the city or the region, they're often in the sort of mid-20s. And so to be up above 50% is really sort of telling that the voters were in a pretty bad mood locally as they were getting their ballots. The other thing is the issues. How are voters sort of responding to some of the major issues that the candidates were talking about, issues that maybe they were voting on the ballot? And these are data also from this OPB survey, and they're really telling. We asked voters, these are numbers specifically for the city of Portland, how do you rate the job approval of your local elected officials? Now, it could be mayor and city council, it could be county commissioners as well, so it wasn't specific. But on all these issues that you see at the bottom. And I want to share these because I want to kind of give some context for how people were seeing the election and the issues that mattered to them. You might really think that COVID was a predominant issue, but it wasn't. I'll get to that in a second. But also, voters gave local elected officials really good marks on how they're managing COVID. So 67% said in the city of Portland that they approve of the job performance of local electeds on how they're managing COVID. Really good marks. Also on transportation, real positive marks there too. 66% approved, just 28% disapproved. Now, if we would have asked this question, say in January of 2019, I think the numbers have been a bit different, but a lot less traffic. I'm not going to talk right now about the Metro Transportation Bond, but just sort of seed the thought for maybe for Q&A is that voters, when they're getting that question to raise their taxes on transportation, they generally were pretty satisfied with the way things were going right now. Now, in the economy, things are a bit mixed. Now, but here's where things change. Crime, 56% disapprove. Race relations, 61% disapprove. How they're managing the protests, 70% disapprove. And how they're managing homelessness, 90% disapprove. And it's really that last number that I want to come to the next slide. So we also asked voters, gosh, what's the most important problem facing Portland today? Here they could have said anything that they wanted. We didn't give them the list. We didn't ask them anything specific. Just let them speak. And then we listened, put those into categories. And here's what they told us. 34%, more than any other category by almost 3 times, said that homelessness was their #1 issue. Homelessness is been the driving political issue in Portland and the metro region for the last 4 or 5 years. I'd also say it's a driving political issue in other parts of the state, but particularly in the city of Portland. So despite a summer of COVID, despite a summer of protests, despite a number of real questions about policing, homelessness was still the dominant issue on voters' minds. And then when we look at voter support, were you going to plan to vote for Wheeler or vote for Anne Arone? Voters who said that homelessness was the #1 issue were planning to vote for Wheeler. And I think that some of the context and sort of the landscape that people have been thinking about for this election has underplayed this as an issue and have maybe overemphasized protests, at least come November. If things might have been different, say in August or even September, but come to November, homelessness was rising again. And that really, for voters who said that was the most important issue, they were Wheeler voters. Racism, protests, you can see that they're lower. COVID, just 7%, law enforcement, 6%. I'll note that transportation is not on this list. And again, the Metro Transportation Bond didn't pass, and I think part of the reason why is it wasn't a priority for voters. Now, a couple other things I just want to put out there, and I will say my thoughts aren't fully formed on this, but I do really think that they're important for all of us to think about if you're a City of Portland resident. On the left here is the election outcome by precinct in the City of Portland. The blue color is where Wheeler won those precincts, and the green color is where Sarah Ann won. On the right is a map of Portland that shows where communities of color are more predominant. So the green is higher percentages of communities of color. And I'll note that Ted Wheeler did both best where the highest percentage of white voters or where white community members are, but also the highest percentage of where communities of color are too. And then here, it's a little bit harder to read, but the same sort of chart that shows median income. Again, Ted Wheeler did best in the wealthiest parts of the city. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but here in sort of this part of the city. And then he also did best in the lowest income parts of the city as well. And so this was a race that had some dynamics. I don't think people were anticipating that the candidate that would appeal to both of those demographics, but it's really quite clear that he did. I'm going to turn to Washington County. There's lots that we could say more about Portland, but in my limited time, I do want to just touch on a couple other things. In the metro region, we're really seeing this rapid change in Washington County. And this is just, there's lots of ways we could look at this, but here is the Democratic vote margin in presidential elections from 1996 to 2020. So in 1996, Bill Clinton won Washington County by 7 percentage points. And then you can see as the years go on, Obama in 2008 won Washington County by 22 percentage points. And in 2020, Biden won Washington County by 35 percentage points. It's really difficult for Republicans to win statewide if they're going to get walloped in Washington or Multnomah County, but now also in Washington County as well. And I'll note about Washington County, there's 3 key factors about it. It is relatively young, it's diverse, and it's highly educated. And those are all groups in the last couple decades, really, especially the last decade, that have become increasingly Democratic. And then just one other bit to extend out to the state, because I really want to highlight that Oregon is becoming more and more divided. And there's lots of ways we could look at this, but here's just one. I'm going to show you the median vote margin in Oregon counties. And so to think about this, if Multnomah County, Biden carried it by 61 percentage points. Lake County in Southern Oregon, Trump won by 61 percentage points, okay? In 1992, the median margin in Oregon of all our counties was 6 percentage points. So the typical county, there was about a 6 percentage point difference between Clinton and Dole. Or Clinton and, was it Dole that year? I forget, I'm getting my years mixed up. But 6 percentage points. But then watch what happens in the years to come. In 96, it's 12%. In 2000, it's 20%. In 2000, Gore just won Oregon by about 7,000 votes. And then it goes to 20%, 22%, 24%, 30%, it's now 33 percentage points. Our counties are going in different directions. Our voters are going in different directions. And we can see that lots of ways, but we're becoming a much more divided state. So I'm gonna pause there. One other point. One issue that I don't think has gotten near the attention that it deserves in selection, a lot of money was spent on the transportation measure. I do wanna call out that in the Portland metro region now in May and in November now, we've had 2 income taxes on the ballot. Both have won convincingly. As communities deal with how to fund local services, I really think that they're going to be looking to the success, the voter success of those measures and be considering it in their local communities as well. It could be a real pivot point in how we fund local services in the state. And then there I'll stop. These are some additional questions that maybe seed the Q&A for later. But with that, I will turn it over to fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, John. I know for me personally, I've had the opportunity to see John speak several times, and really grateful for your expertise. And I know that I always learn something about our community hearing you speak. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Next up, we are going to have Dr. Priscilla Southwell. Are you ready to speak, Dr. Southwell? Wonderful.
So my emphasis is a little bit different than John's, but I appreciate this because it overlaps a little bit. We all overlap. There's so many topics to talk about. So I have 3 V's to talk about: voter turnout, vote by mail, and regrettably voter suppression. So let's talk about the good stuff first. Voter turnout. I'm speaking nationally, but I will also speak about Oregon because Oregon smells like a rose in all of this. So you all know of this. In the 2020 elections, the estimates, the pretty good estimates, suggest that voter turnout nationwide was 66.6, which, you know, depending on how you measure it, is the highest since 1900. So that's great. And the 2 main reasons were the increase for this increase in turnout were the perceived closeness of the presidential race, which, to speak as a political scientist, is like a no-brainer, but it matters if you're in a certain battleground state. So clearly turnout went up, particularly in those states where the race was at least predicted to be close. But the other one is, and the obvious one that I'm going to spend more time about, is the expanded opportunities for vote by mail voting, particularly due to COVID-19, as states, even in their primaries in the spring, were either reluctantly or not so reluctantly adopted this electoral reform, which Oregon did in 2000. So this expected increase in voter turnout is consistent with, as I said, every political science researcher that talks about this, but also in terms of perceived closeness of the election, but also in terms of the effect of vote by mail. It's not just my previous research. Lots of more recent research has said that vote by mail always increases turnout in presidential and special elections, so on. All right, so good news. We have increased voter turnout and so on. The cloud behind the silver lining, or the depressing part of 2020, is voter suppression, which I was asked to talk about. It has been around for a long time, as most of the audience knows about. Unfortunately, I think and regrettably, it actually has increased and did increase in the 2020 election due to the anticipated rise in vote by mail ballots. So let me be very brief about this. You all know this, but let's just go through the standard thing. Voter suppression in the United States is, unfortunately, a traditional method of reducing the abilities of people to vote. And the League has been known this for many, not just years, but decades. So, you know, we could even say that holding elections on Tuesdays rather than on a weekend or holidays, the way most of the nations have done, is voter suppression. So I'm not going to go through the usual things of this. I want to talk in more contemporary terms. Clearly, it's hard to know what's recent and what's traditional, but the shortage of polling equipment, the shortage of poll workers leads to long lines. All of you know this. The cutbacks and curtailment of early voting, even in person, the curtailment of drop-off sites, as you all know, in terms of Texas, and the state Supreme Court ruling on this. Okay, so these are voter suppression. And let me emphasize this. This is voter, V-O-T-E-R. So in 2020, it was vote, in my opinion, and I'm going out on a limb here. This is just not disallowing, or I mean, you can have voter suppression, but okay, you get to vote. You get to vote in one way or another. You go to the polls, you vote absentee, you vote early, you vote universal vote by mail, you at least get to vote. And you think, okay, this is good. Okay, this is vote suppression, which is, in my opinion, even more serious. A voter gets to vote, but his or her vote doesn't count. That's what is really, unfortunately, happening more often than not, and too often in 2020, and it's ongoing. So the first ones are obvious, you all know about it. Some of it has to do with the problems with the USPS. And you know that our Postmaster General, LaJoy, announced in August that there would be budgetary cutbacks to the US Postal Service, including reduction in employee overtime hours and elimination of voter postal sorting machines, which caused panic, as it should have, all across the nation, even in Oregon, which smells like a rose, causing concern about potential vote-by-mail voters. Is my ballot going to arrive in time? Which led to, a lot of people saying, no, I'm going to drop off my ballot at a drop-off site, which not in Oregon, but other places were curtailed in number, as I mentioned, in terms of Texas. Then there was the announcement on November 3rd of this year that the USPS reported that 300,000 ballots, okay, this is across the nation, were missing, meaning they had been scanned by the USPS, but they had not given an exit scan. So they had not left the post office. And so there was a lawsuit, and a DC court order said you need to sweep all post offices on this day and future days to make sure that these ballots get delivered. The USPS, in its infinite wisdom, decided, no, we can handle it. I have no idea how many of these 300,000 ballots that were, quote, missing on election day actually showed up. And it's pretty interesting to look at the map, the US map by the Washington Post, but it's an amazing number of Western states where the number of lost ballots or missing ballots was higher than average. All right, so to cut to the chase, which I think is more important than the USPS, it's called the rejection of vote-by-mail ballots, and just be glad you live in Oregon. All right, so what are the things that cause ballots to be rejected? You will probably know this. You don't sign the outside of your mailing envelope, or you have an incorrect signature that doesn't match your original signature on record when you registered to vote. We all know that. Then there's the naked ballots. I've learned a lot of new vocabulary in the last month. Naked ballots are where someone votes by mail and they, for some reason or another, don't include their secrecy sleeve, as it's called in Oregon, but a secrecy envelope in a lot of other states, especially those who are voting by mail for the first time. So what happens when you're in Oregon and the secrecy envelope is optional? Not true in most states. Okay, so what happens, and I'm going to zoom in on Pennsylvania, like the rest of the nation, because I have so many relatives there and there's so many lawsuits there. If you do not include your secrecy envelope, pardon me if you already know this, your vote is not counted. If you do not sign your mailing envelope, your vote is not counted. If you have an incorrect signature, your vote is not counted. Now in Oregon, if you have a naked ballot, if you have no secrecy envelope, you're okay. All right, what's the difference between Oregon and Pennsylvania? You all know this. Two members of my household, I would say expanded household, messed up. They didn't have a naked ballot because there's really no such thing in Oregon, but they either failed to sign the mailing envelope, or they had, they have 5 signatures, I don't know. And what happened? They got a letter, first of all, because they voted early. I'm sure this has happened to all of you. And they got a letter from the local county elections office saying, you messed up. You have this remedy in which to fix it. Okay. Does that happen in many states? No. In Pennsylvania, naked ballots are not counted. Missing incorrect signatures, not counted. But what happened? You all know this, right? Maybe you don't know it. Okay, in Pennsylvania, actually, the secretary, she's not called the Secretary of State, she's called the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, said, I understand this. You can't count naked ballots. That's a Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling. You can't count any ballot that has a missing or incorrect signature, but we can notify voters, just like Oregon. We can notify voters, and if it's early enough, they can fix it or cure it, as it's called. And what is the current lawsuit? No, you can't do that. You can't do that. Even though the Secretary of the Commonwealth informed every county, yes, you can notify a voter that they can fix their ballot, or if they can't do it in time, they can cast a provisional ballot. And that's the subject of the current, it's one of the subjects of the current lawsuits in Pennsylvania. All right.
I wanted to let you know you've done about 10 minutes now, just so you can.
Okay, I have one. So I knew I would go over. I'm used to 15-minute lectures. Okay, so my response is, civically, this is no way to run an election. There's no reason why you should have people who make mistakes not be able to correct it. But my more strategic advice or response is that when you suppress voters or votes, do you also suppress voters and voting within your own party? If so, this will come back to haunt you in the next election or two.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad that you got that those ending remarks in. It seems really important. And I'm sure we'll have questions related to that at the end. So thank you very much, Dr. Southwell. Next up, Barbara Dudley.
Hi. So I want to start with something that has been very much on my mind, which is that if there were clear victors in any of these elections, it was the election officials, the poll workers, the secretaries of state, including Boockvar and including today, I don't know how many of you have been listening to the Secretary of State in Georgia, who is a Republican, who has been asked to resign by both the Republican candidates for the Senate and has received death threats and is just generally under a whole lot of pressure because of the audit of the vote there, and has been about as solid and full of integrity as you could ask of any Secretary of State. And I would say that Republican or Democrat, that the election officials, the secretaries of state, are the real winners in this election. And they have managed to strengthen people's confidence, I think, in the mechanics of our democracy, if not in the content of our political discourse. So that's just something I think is really important to keep in mind. This was a very close race, whether you're looking Portland or you're looking the country. In Portland, you know, obviously the race for mayor, there were 3 candidates, and I think it's pretty well imaginable that it was Teresa Rayford's write-in candidacy that meant that Ted Wheeler won with a minority, with less than a majority of the votes. So, and there were many split tickets, and there were 4 states, by the way, where the libertarian vote made the difference between Biden and Trump. So that I think that was true. I'm trying to remember: Arizona, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. If you look at the raw numbers, it was the libertarian who kept, well, assuming those votes would have gone to Trump, so I won't argue that, but just that made the difference. Neither Biden nor Trump won a majority in those states. So it was very, very close. And we still have a long ways to go. We haven't certified the results in all the states. We haven't certified the results in most of the states yet. We're having a recount in Georgia. We're having a recount in Wisconsin, maybe in Nevada, who knows. We are not going to know until December 14th, really, who our president actually is. There are a lot of lawsuits out there, although they are, I think, mostly viewed as quite frivolous. But we still have to get through state legislators. We have to get through electors, and we have to get through the president who is reluctant to accept reality. So it's not over yet. But I think, as John pointed out, the obvious takeaway is that both the country and the state of Oregon are deeply divided. And they're divided by rural versus urban. I mean, I don't know how many of you followed the ballot initiatives in a number of our rural counties, excuse me, about whether they would like to join Idaho and get out of Oregon. It passed actually in 2 counties, Jefferson and Union County. Not that they can do it that rapidly, but there are many steps they would have to go through. But it tells you something. But we're also divided not just by rural and urban, but by class, working class versus the people who have enough wealth to not be worried about the current joblessness situation and the current shutdown of the economy. We're divided by generation. We're certainly divided by race and immigration status. I don't know if you followed, but a number of Republicans now are starting to say something that I personally find very ironic, which is we are now the party of the working class. This is the Republican Party saying that. And, to some extent, they're right. There were a large number of working class, white working class people who voted for Donald Trump. Whether they would vote for another Republican or not remains to be seen. But both parties are really going through a tremendous transition right now and are really very uneasy electoral coalitions. And I think that is possibly the most important thing for us to take away. The Republican Party has the Tea Party libertarians, the fiscal conservatives, but they also have a lot of businesses that are expecting, and farmers who are expecting government support and would not support fiscal conservatism if it meant they weren't going to get their subsidies. You have chambers of commerce, you have gun advocates, you have evangelicals, you have and you have the disaffected working class. In the Democrats, you have an equally divided coalition. You have the Blue Dog Democrats, Kurt Schrader, for example. You have the progressives who are, and there are many forms of progressives. They're climate activists, they're Black Lives Matter activists, there's LGBTQ activists, there's dreamers, there's the public sector unions. The private sector unions are more inclined to vote for Trump. And you have the tech companies and Wall Street on the other end. So you have a real mishmash in both parties. And many of them split their tickets. There were a lot of Republicans who voted for Biden, but then voted for Republican senators or House members. That's why you saw Biden get himself elected, but you also saw the Democrats lose seats in the House and not gain the blue wave that they were expecting in the Senate. And here's another interesting thing. In Florida, the Republicans voted for Trump by quite a large margin. But they also voted for a $15 minimum wage that was out there on a ballot initiative. And that got 1 million more votes than Biden got. It passed. So think about that. There were a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump, 1 million plus, who voted for Donald Trump in Florida, but also voted for a $15 minimum wage. Both Missouri and Arizona had also raised their minimum wage, not quite to 15, I think to 12 something, through ballot initiatives in the last couple of elections. Those are conservative states. Those are so-called red states. Here in Portland, the ballot initiative that got the highest support was for universal pre-K. That cuts across party lines. That is people, working people, who desperately need somebody to take good care of their children during the day while the parents are at work. And it is the people who work in childcare who desperately need a living wage, because that ballot initiative also included a decent wage. I think it was a $15 minimum wage, but don't hold me to it, for childcare workers at the same time. We also supported in large numbers here in Oregon, the campaign finance reform initiative that was, or the referral that was on the ballot. That means a lot, because there are a whole lot of people, both Republican and Democrat, who feel very strongly that it is campaign donations that are making the difference more than votes. And until we get some kind of serious campaign finance reform, hopefully on a federal level as well, but at least here in Oregon, where we've had no limits whatsoever, people are not going to have a whole lot of faith that their vote matters one way or the other. So my conclusion, I guess, is just basically that both parties are headed for major realignments. And I think whichever one best addresses the issues that are affecting most people right now, of job loss, not just from COVID, but also from technological changes and from export of capital and therefore jobs overseas. They're suffering from student debt. They're suffering from loss of their pensions. They're suffering from loss of their health care, and just huge income inequality. And whichever party persuades the electorate that they are serious about dealing with those issues is the party that's going to prevail. And I don't think we know yet which party that is. So I'll end there for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It's always a pleasure to get to hear you speak. Real tour de force here in our community. So we are going to ask now for the panelists if they have any questions for each other that have come up during their remarks. But before that, I did want to remind everyone who is in the audience that if you have questions for the panelists, please direct message Chris Kobe, who you can see in the chat. And Chris is curating questions, helping me collect them in the same way that we used to do with the 3x5 cards. So if you could get your questions to Chris, he will pass them along to me, and I will then present them to the panelists. So I'm wanting to turn this over now to the panelists. As you heard from each other, were there questions that came up? Barbara, was that you signaling to me?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
How do you want us to signal, James?
Well, that's fine. I can see all of you.
Okay, all right. So my question is for John, because one of the things he said in his, when he was screen sharing his numbers that I found perplexing was the number of people in Portland who named homelessness as the top priority. A problem, which is sort of obvious. You just have to walk down the street and it's obviously a huge problem, but is there some way of parsing out what the hell they think ought to, excuse my language, what they think ought to be done about it? Because, yeah.
So it's really challenging. So part of the reason that homelessness is a persistent political problem here in Portland and other places, one is just the real life difficult circumstances for those who are living in the street and the challenges that has for everybody. But the other is that there isn't clear political consensus on what to be done or what the root causes are. And so when we ask voters, you know, this is paraphrasing what a question might be, but is homelessness primarily an individual responsibility, some sort of failing drug addiction, mental health problem, or is it a housing problem? Do we just not have affordable housing, enough affordable housing? It depends on when you ask, but basically voters are split on that. So is it do you deal with this with a drug addiction or mental health treatment, or you deal with this with housing? Now, I know that those aren't mutually exclusive things. I totally get that, but we don't get clear consensus one way or the other on that. Nor do we get consensus on the question of, do you think that homelessness is a problem that we can solve? Or is it just something that is always going to be with us? I would say the other is there, gosh, I hate to use this term, but it's the best one that's coming to me right now, is silent majority. The activist community around homelessness has clear ideas about what they want done, but they often run counter to those who aren't activists on homelessness issues. And I think that one perspective gets a lot of political weight and attention and one less. And so I think there's sometimes some misreading of where the public might be on the issue.
Thank you. for both the question and the response. Yes, Dr. Southwell.
So about you had on your lingering questions, what about the failure of the transportation measure, the light rail?
It's interesting that you call it a light rail measure. And I think that's probably,
I live in Portland, except occasionally. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's the reason I say that is I think that's part of the challenge. So the Metro measure failed. I can't remember the number exactly off the top of my head, but something like 58-42, somewhere in that ballpark. It's the one measure locally that had a lot of opposition. I'll note that just if you look statewide, there were 68 ballot measures, local funding measures across the state. I believe 52 passed with are passing now. So it was generally a good election cycle for local funding measures to pass. So Metro is an exception to that. I think well, first, these are speculation. I think there's additional research that should be done on why it failed. But one of the reasons is that in COVID, transportation just wasn't a priority for voters. They're just driving a lot less. So that's an important one. I think that the opposition campaign that framed it as a wage tax really resonated with voters, that this is not a time during times of unemployment to be putting that tax on there. And then just the fact, for whatever reasons, it lost in all three counties. And so that means it was no surprise that it failed in Clackamas County. It was never going to pass there. It got about 35% of the vote. You probably need something closer to 45 or something to be successful. It failed in Multnomah County. So the most tax sort of supportive voters rejected it. And I'll say crucially, it failed in Washington County. So I think it's got 41% in Washington County, and that's where the bulk of the money was going to be spent on a max rail project. So if you can't get the most tax-friendly voters to say yes, and you can't get those who are directly going to be benefiting from the tax to say yes, there's some real challenges.
I understand how it would have extended and who would have been the beneficiaries. And I'm very glad that Multnomah County passed the preschool, which was a pretty hefty tax. But was the tax on the preschool more progressive, and the tax on the transportation less progressive?
Well,
Yes.
I'll let others sort of define what that is, but they're different tax mechanisms. Maybe Barbara could speak to that.
In terms of high income paying more than lower income.
One was a payroll tax on employers, the other was an income tax on individuals. So Barbara, why don't you address that?
Yeah, the universal pre-K, one was a tax on high income individuals, and I think that is redistributionist, and I think that goes to the hearts of the Portlanders. But the other thing about it, the Metro transportation measure that I think is true is that at least in Portland, if they had separated out the pieces of it, so there was a big piece of it that was going to make streets safer in East Portland and North Portland for people, because being a pedestrian out there is very dangerous, particularly for young children on their way to school. And there was a lot in it that was going to make for safer streets. If they had separated that out from the extension of the Orange Line, nobody's riding the MAX these days. So, not only are they not driving cars, but they're not riding the MAX. So the major part of the funding was going to go to extending the MAX line. And I think people just thought, well, who needs that? But I think if they had separated out the safer streets part, particularly in less wealthy communities and more diverse communities, which is where it was targeted, it would have been a no-brainer.
Okay, but let me add one thing. So the things might change when COVID-19 is over, when people start commuting more. But am I correct that the preschool initiative was Multnomah only?
That's correct. It's Multnomah County only.
Yeah.
Okay.
But Priscilla, you're bringing up an issue that I touched on really quickly, and I'm probably broken record on this in all the talks that I do, but I really do think it's critical. Oregon historically has funded local services and major funding projects like capital projects with property taxes. And editorializing a little bit, which I try not to do too much, but our property tax system is just broken. And so, I spend a lot of my time working with local governments, figuring out how to, talk to voters about raising revenue for, public safety levy or for a library bond or whatever it might be. And it's our system's broken. It's like a whole nother conversation. And so they're looking for other revenue streams. For a long time, Oregon has been talking about, well, will we ever have a sales tax? And for various reasons, we haven't had one. And I think politically it's very challenging. But the fact that the Portland metro region twice at a time when, the economy's not doing well, have said overwhelmingly yes to income taxes. I gotta believe that voters in Lane County, in Eugene, and or Washington County are going to be saying, whoa, this might be a mechanism for us. There's no constitutional limit on how high it can be. There's no constitutional limit how long it can be. There's no constitutional limit about like rates at a particular community level. So like I do think we might look back at that May homelessness services measure funded by income tax, and then hear the preschool for all, and see that as an inflection point, less so for what they funded, but how they funded it.
Yeah. Yep, I think it's an important point.
So thank you for that excellent discussion, for those questions for each other. We do have a lot of great questions that have already been submitted. I hope audience members will continue to submit questions to Chris Kobe in the chat. The first question that I think all of you might have something to say about, but I thought I would direct it first to Barbara Dudley, because Barbara referenced this in your remarks about the role of money in politics. So money in politics has been a continuing controversy for many years. That's certainly nothing new. I'm wondering if you have anything specific to say about money in these most recent elections. Here, in Portland, we had the first iteration of our new public financing system, open and accountable elections. We also saw, maybe Barbara or John or somebody could speak to if this was atypical. It seemed like the independent expenditures were atypical for campaigns locally, the size of them, certainly their impact. Just wondered if you could speak a little bit about the role of money. Was it different, less, more? And then, if people have thoughts about that at the national or state level, I'd love to hear that as well.
You're asking, I think, the wrong person, James, by asking me. I mean, you should be asking yourself. Actually, you are the expert on this question much more than I. I did not.
I also enjoy your deep expertise.
Right, but I don't have information. I always have opinions, as you know, but I don't have enough information other than the metro measure. And in terms of the public financing of elections in Portland and how it went, it was kind of a mess, as you know, through this election season, because it had to be ascertained several times over by the courts and then the auditor about whether it was in effect or not in effect. And as you know, that came up as a serious dispute between Ayanna Rona and Wheeler, because Wheeler was spending outside of the limits. It's not the public financing, but outside of the campaign limits. And yet we didn't know what the courts here in Oregon were going to say about it. And once they made their declaration that the limits were legal, which was incredibly good, then the auditor had to decide how much retroactively that was going to be applied, and so on and so forth. But as I say, you are far more expert on this than I, and probably, John, you probably know a lot more about it too. So I will not pretend to speculate anymore.
I just say from a public opinion standpoint, we've asked voters about public campaign limits or public financing campaigns, or things in that ballpark, and voters consistently tell us that they support them. There's specifics and you can move things a bit, but I think it's pretty clear. And then you see when a measure like on the ballot this last election, voters overwhelmingly endorsed it. I do think that voters are quite inconsistent about it, though, because I see very little evidence in their behavior that they are moved or will punish a candidate for their fundraising or for how much they spend. So on the one hand, I think that they endorse it in the abstract, but in the specifics of the issues or the candidates they support, I see very little evidence that it's a priority for them, or they'll punish a candidate because of it.
Yes, please, Dr. Southwell.
So I actually have done research on this, and Oregon needs to clean up its act. They're one of 5 states that have no limits on what you can give to a statewide candidate or even a state candidate. So there are federal limits, which are paltry and inappropriate and whatever. But I did analysis and looked at our neighbors, Washington and California, and the per capita spending, because Washington and California have had campaign spending limits for more than a decade. The per capita spending limits for both our governor, secretary of state, state senate, and state legislative races are higher than Washington and California. So what does that say? That's been that way for a decade. So I'm glad the voters, I don't care if they care about it or don't care about it. They should care about it. All of us should care about it. What bothers me most about it is candidate selection. So what kind of candidate can run for governor? What kind of candidate can run for secretary of state or attorney general or whatever? If there are no limits on what they can get, forget independent expenditures, direct limits, then it tends to filter out candidates who can't, or are not personally wealthy, or can't appeal to wealthy interests. And that's true of the state senate and the state legislature. So this is why Common Cause has singled out Oregon as being one of the few states that needs to sort of join this century.
Thank you.
To editorialize.
Completely appropriate. And actually in line with the League of Women Voters position on the issue as well. The next question actually is for you, Dr. Southwell. So not to put you on the spot, but earlier today, the Wayne County, Michigan Board of Canvassers deadlocked on certifying the election results for the county, which voted for President-elect Joseph Biden Jr. by a margin of nearly 323,000 votes. Does that mean those votes won't be counted in Michigan's final tally? What do we think is going to happen here? And does that action, in your judgment, constitute a form of voter suppression?
Okay, so I am a political scientist, and I am not an election law lawyer, which is frankly a new field, and it has been since 2000. So I can only say I did read about this. This is one county. And if they cannot certify their results, they are one county out of the entire state of Michigan. What that will mean for the entire state of Michigan, I can't say. So again, the state legislature in Michigan and Wisconsin have said, even if the final popular votes cannot be certified by December 8th, that does not mean the state legislature is going to take over and be faithless electors. Michigan voted overwhelmingly for, okay, not overwhelmingly, with a comfortable margin in terms of the popular vote. Would one county drag down the certification of the actual votes, which would then drag down the certification of the electoral votes on December 14th? I doubt it, but you know, this is an unusual election year. I cannot tell how the courts would deal with this, but it is a mess. It's not a huge mess.
Thank you very much. And I'll clarify, this was a question from the audience, and I have had another member of the audience weigh in to say that later today, the Wayne County Commission reversed themselves. So maybe it's
Thank you.
not too much of an issue.
I feel okay now.
But nonetheless, we appreciate you educating us on.
Okay.
So the next question from the audience, I think, is largely directed to John, but I'd be happy if anyone else feels that they should weigh in on it as well. And there's first kind of a philosophical question. which is, do you think that releasing polling results influences the actual vote? And I want to broaden that a little bit to combine with another question that we had, which is just to kind of get a sense from you, John, when thinking about polling at the national level, you know, how far, how did the polls do? You know, there was a lot of discussion in 2016 about how far the polls were off. On election night, I certainly was among the many people thinking, wait, I just saw what pollsters, you know, estimated the map was going to look like, and this looks nothing like that. Now, you know, 2 weeks later, that the map is looking much closer to what pollsters had predicted. But I'm just wanting to get a sense of one, I mean, the first question of how, if you think it influences how people actually vote, and then secondly, how did pollsters nationally do this time around?
So the first question, I don't think there's direct evidence the way that the question I think was asked, that people see a poll result and then therefore decide to participate in the election or not. One, I think that people vote for all sorts of reasons, and the poll isn't one of them. I do think that people get more excited during competitive elections, and to the extent that a poll can demonstrate that an election is competitive, that might inspire sort of activity. They also, voters, it's not just the presidential election that people are interested in, right? They have senatorial elections and congressional elections and mayoral elections, and there may be polling or not polling on any one of those. However, I will say that, you know, as a pollster, our work informs decisions that candidates make. Our work informs decisions that campaigns make. And I do believe that what candidates say and how campaigns act to influence voters does matter. And so, I mean, they have an effect. I just don't think it's that direct effect. People see a poll number and then you know, decide how to participate in the election. Two, how well the polls did. I was just looking this up now. So nationally, first of all, I appreciate the way you framed your question, because I do think things look a lot different now than they did on election night. But so right now, nationally, the polls had Trump, sort of the national average is 538 on election day at 43%. He's now at 47%, and they had Biden at 52. He's at 51. You know, there are going to be some big misses in some places. That's particularly going to happen when you have lots of polling done, and the direction of the misses does seem to be pretty systematic in one way, and I can talk more about that if people are interested. But a lot of the narrative got set about the polls on election night before millions and millions and millions and millions of Democratic votes were being counted, whether it was in those, you know, states like Pennsylvania or Michigan, but also in New York and California and in Illinois. And so the national polling is looking quite good. I believe 49 of the 51 states, counting DC, the polls predicted the outcome. You're going to be able to find some polls that really missed, and those could be outliers. There could be something systematic going on. But I think 2 weeks later, things are looking quite a bit better than they were on election night.
So I don't know if, you know, and feel free if this is not the right question to ask or something, but I do feel like in the polling field, there was some soul searching after some of the miss in 2016, and as you're looking at the, you know, much better results this time around, do you feel like polling as a field has kind of corrected what those systemic problems were in 2016?
So in 2016, of course, tons of research has gone into this that happened over the course of years, right? So we're now 2 weeks after the election. We don't have the benefit of that research that was being done. But I think we're pretty clear on what happened. Pollsters underestimated turnout among not college educated whites and overestimated turnout among communities of color. And they did that in particular states, the upper Midwest states, those close elections, things got wrong. And so there's lots of talk about how to deal with education this cycle. And I think if those are lessons to be learned, we learned them. I'll note that in 2012, the polls underestimated Obama. And so also 2018, the polls were just fantastic. And so some of it is just going to be some variation from year to year. I do think that the early sort of explanations that there are, I don't know, shy Trump voters or voters who are saying that they, were undecided but were actually decided, I think we don't know the answers to those questions yet, because we don't know yet what the actual shape of the electorate was, how many Democrats showed up, how many Republicans actually showed up, how many people of certain ages. We're not going to know that till votes are certified in these states. And so it's pretty difficult to say, did we miss voters? Like, did we just not reach them? Or were we trying to reach the wrong people?
So helpful. Thank you very much. So our next question, I guess, deals with all of this has been about the results, the outcome of the election, but we haven't talked very much about how the outcomes have affected, the ideological breakdown of our various legislative bodies. And especially since we haven't talked really at all about the Oregon State Legislature, I wondered if we'd start there, and then if people are interested to talk about the changing face of Congress, or the changing kind of makeup of Congress, I think that would also be interesting. If somebody, has a sense of what the new, City of Portland Council, what the new additions mean for the council, I think that would be interesting too. But given that we haven't talked at all about state legislature in Salem, I wonder if somebody would like to start us off on what the outcomes of the 2020 election mean for upcoming legislative session.
I'll start.
Perfect.
I mean, one of the things that everybody knows, I think, is that we lost a couple of seats, important seats on the coast. But mostly the Democrats lost some important seats on the coast. One of them I was interested, the seat formerly held by Senator Arnie Roblin, went to Republican Dick Anderson. And it was one of those where the Green Party made the difference. And I think when you parse that out, you're going to find that that was all about Jordan Cove, which I think also was probably the issue that lost. Kathy McEwen's seat was the Democrat contesting that. She was a Democrat. She retired. The Democrat contesting it was Cal Nakamoto, who did not take a position on Jordan Cove, but I think the assumption was, being a Democrat, he was more likely to oppose it, and so the Republican boomer right won. And then there was another seat, the seat that had formerly been held by Tiffany Mitchell, a Democrat, who also retired, and that went to a Republican. So that's significant. And in Hood River, it was by the narrowest of margins. And in Astoria, Clatsop County, Brad Witt's vote was being decided by 100 votes, and I'm not sure that it's concluded, but I think Brad Witt won. So anyhow, a section of the state, i.e. the coast, has now joined the rural counties in being the red part of the state. So the blue part of the state is a very narrow swath down the Willamette River. And not very far down the Willamette River, and includes then a little pocket in Bend, where we may or may not see a change of party in terms of the Senate, but we have seen it in terms of the House. So that's what I have to say about the legislature.
And so do you think, Barbara, that we're going to see any kind of significant policy differences? I mean, it seems like the total number of people by partisan breakdown changed only very slightly, right? I think Democrats lost one seat in the House and maintained the same margin in the Senate. Do you think that further divide between Republicans really being much more focused in concentrated in rural areas, basically losing all of the seats, I think, that they held in urban areas in Bend and in Salem, right? Do you think that that's going to result in real different legislative outcomes?
I don't know. I mean, the Democrats will still have their super majority. The Republicans will still be able to deny a quorum on votes. I mean, what I would hope, I should think it would get people's attention that the coast has now gone from blue to red. And it's like making our urban-rural divide that much more poignant. And frankly, that has to be addressed. And it has to be addressed by both parties talking about it and not just walking out and or passing things with a supermajority. I mean, unless we're going to send everybody who's not Democrat over to Idaho, we better come up with some answers. And that means having conversations that are not currently going on.
And do you think, I mean, sorry, just on that last point, that last comment, do you think that maybe the geographic bifurcation or separation makes it less likely that those conversations happen cross party in a way that maybe when people shared a district in the past, you know, two representatives of different parties who were in the same Senate district or something, or even in the same community, made it more likely for that to happen?
Probably. Yeah, I think that's probably right. But I also think that we're infected with the same partisan virus that the country is infected with right now, and it's that needs the conversation.
Well, I'm going to put a pin in that because I think all three of you mentioned increasing partisanship in your remarks. So I would love to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But before we switch to that, I don't know, Dr. Southwell or John, if you have any thoughts on the Oregon legislature. And then I'd like to kind of talk that same question about change in makeup at the congressional level.
I'll let Dr. Southwell go.
Okay, so I agree with Barbara that there's still a super majority for the Democrats in both houses. That doesn't mean they're not, they can't avoid the quorum problem. They're going to have walkouts, and I know they will. What I am most worried about for Oregon, and I hope they can deal with it, is the redistricting. Because as you all know, unless the census is totally off, Oregon is in line to get an additional U.S. House seat. Where that U.S. House seat is going to come from is going to be a difficult task for the state legislature to deal with. 10 years ago, they dealt with it quite well. I mean, it was a democratically controlled legislature, and they avoid all of the lawsuits that have plagued, as long as I've lived in Oregon, they have plagued the redistricting process. It's going to be a little bit more difficult here because for all of you Democrats out there, you should be aware in this election and in the previous election that close to 40% of Oregon voters voted for a U.S. House candidate. So obviously, they only 20% of our 5 representatives are Republican. And why is that the case? Because they're all in the 2nd District of Oregon, right? But if we have to start creating, which we probably will, if the state legislature has to start creating 6 districts, how are they going to do that and ignore, this is not my opinion, this is the actual voting record for the last actually 2 decades of Oregon, that they have hovered between 39 and 42% voting for a Republican House candidate. So how is the, I'm sorry, I'm like, don't shoot the messenger here, that they are going to have a very difficult task when they create this 6th district, not creating one that is much more competitive. I mean, I actually think my own district, my sort of semi-district of the 4th district, is becoming increasingly competitive between Democrats and Republicans. I suspect that the 6th district is probably also going to have to be more competitive than any Democrat wishes. So that's actually what I think is, in addition to campaign financing, I think are going to be front burner issues for the incoming state legislature and state senate, or in general.
Thank you. John, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I guess 2 things. One on redistricting, I'm quite cynical about it. I think Democrats nationally bemoan gerrymandering quite a bit, but I suspect that it's extremely likely that the Democrats in the legislature will draw that district to find some other way to put a Democrat in that seat. You got to ask. So Oregon has 5 seats. We're likely to have 6. There are more Democrats than there are Republicans in the state, but we're probably not a 5 Democrat to 1 Republican sort of breakdown. But I find it extremely unlikely that the Democrats will draw a district to where Republicans ends up. But we'll see what they do. And I guess I just note some of the demographic changes that Barbara already said, which is that the coast is becoming redder, particularly the southern coast. But really pay attention to what's happening in Deschutes County. Deschutes County now has a majority, or there are more Democrats now in Deschutes County than there are Republicans, and the Democrat just really won handily in Bend. Bend is becoming quite blue. And so you do see sort of the longer term trends perhaps are emerging, where the coast is going one direction and another blue island in another place. And I guess if I had one other point to say about 2022, 2022 is going to be a potentially real pivot point in Oregon's political history. We'll have an open governor seat. We're likely to have this new congressional seat. Our current delegation, Cliff Bentz accepted, has quite a lengthy tenure now in Congress. I'm not sure what the average age is, but I'm probably close to 70 at this point. Ron Wyden will be up again. I presume he runs, but a Senate seat could potentially be open. And so 2022 is really shaping up to be a huge year in Oregon politics.
Thanks so much. Thank you all of you for your responses to that. We only have, unfortunately, about 10 minutes left. I personally could do this all night, but I know that we are facing some broadcast restrictions and other things that are going to curtail the conversation. I do think having the kind of closing thoughts be a little bit about partisanship, and especially if there's anything that we learned from 2020 elections or from elsewhere in the nation that shines some kind of light of, is it increasing in non-affiliated voters? Is it alternative, voting methods? A lot of things have been discussed as being, potential ways to try to head off some of the intense partisanship. And I'm just wondering what, from each of your different perspectives, what you see. Are we headed kind of towards the cliff? Are we turning away to some way that's going to result in better governance, or unknown?
Should I start?
I think you should.
I mean, I'll repeat a little bit of what I said before. I don't think that the real divisions in this country have anything to do with Democrat versus Republican. I think both of those parties are trying very hard to make it seem like it is the important difference. But I think that both parties are such conglomerations of constituencies that don't fit together very well in many instances, that the parties themselves are in the process of splitting apart. They just haven't acknowledged it yet. And they may still be called Democrat and Republican, but there's going to be some reconfiguration. I think that the important thing to look at is what are the majority of people, or what are people, never mind the majority, what are people in this country most concerned about, and what are the things that are dividing them? So if you want to look generationally, you're certainly going to have the climate change issue being a big one with younger generation. You're also going to have police reform and racial justice being a big one with the younger generations. You're going to have dreamers and the immigration issue. And the Republicans might try and appeal to that as well. But it is about those kinds of issues for young people. For older people, it's a sort of, I would say, a lot of terror about the fact that the world is changing so fast, that the job security, the pension security, that the ability to send your kids to college, those kinds of things are evaporating so fast that people are simply terrified. And the fact that what's going on here is paralleled throughout Europe and throughout Latin America, the same divisions within the parties. I mean, just the fact that we don't have a proportional representation system makes it look a little different here, but it is the same thing that's going on. And it's really about the economy and the environment and all of the sort of social changes that we're going through. That's what we need to be thinking about. And it's not just Dems and Republicans.
Thank you. But you don't have a vested interest in it in your work as Working Families Party, right?
No, none.
Thank you very much, Barbara. John or Dr. Southwell?
Go ahead, Doctor. Yeah.
All right, so I think extreme partisanship has got to be on its way out, and it may be wishful thinking or naive thinking, but it actually hasn't worked very well, and it's really not brought results for any party. So I think the notion of walking across the aisle, regardless of what you think about Joe Biden, he did have a reputation of doing that, of talking to people who disagreed with him. And there are lots of other, you have to go back in history, there are lots of other politicians who have done that and done remarkable things, including Lyndon Johnson. How would we have the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, if people weren't willing to talk across the aisle? And my mother was a Republican, a liberal Republican, if you can remember what that was like, a politician in Illinois, and she dealt with a lot of Democrats. So it does work. But I'm kind of with Barbara. I think we need to rock the boat a little bit. And I actually think we should, in respect of the size of the Working Families Party and the Independent Party in Oregon, I think we should be like Maine. And I think we should talk about ranked choice voting. Proportional representation is probably for my grandchildren, but we should talk about that so that third party and independent candidates are not spoilers. And we can start off small, although they did it for the Senate race in Maine. So we should talk about the idea of, I hate to use the term baby steps, but electoral reform that maybe is both, either we minimize partisanship between the Democrats and Republicans, so start to have people that can talk to each other, or we move toward, the second step I would favor, is loosening up the electoral rules so that other voices can have a say in that. And a really, really kind of easy reform is having ranked choice voting. If they can do it in Maine for a senatorial race, we can do it for all kinds of things. And we could have proportional distribution of our electoral votes. We can do all the things. We've already joined the whatever it's called, the popular vote contract. We can someday, I hope, we'll get rid of the Electoral College. I'm not holding my breath. But so we need to just sort of, and I think the league is in league with this, no pun intended. So just kind of let's keep knocking at the door.
Thank you very much. John, you want to close us out?
Yeah, I guess so. It's easy to imagine that the trends we have continuing, and I think that there's good reason to imagine the trends continuing. But I spent a lot of time looking at election history, particularly Oregon election history, and I'm constantly reminded of how much things do change in some unexpected ways. Let me just give you one example. In 1972, McGovern won 4 counties in Oregon. He won Multnomah County, no surprise, but he also won Columbia, Clatsop, and Coos. Not even Lane. Things change. I don't know how they'll change. I don't know when they'll change. I don't know if they'll change in positive ways, but I am confident that things change.
Thank you so much. With that, we are concluding the question and answer portion of our evening. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing their time, their expertise, and all of their knowledge with us here at the League. It's been such a pleasure. Normally, we would have really nice gifts for you that we would give on behalf of the League. But I believe that the Zoom format means that you get our very warm thank yous. But I'm sure that we'll follow up with you afterwards about that. I'm now going to pass it back to our president, Debbie Kay, to close us out for the evening.
Thank you, James, and thank you so very much to our panelists. This was a super stimulating, fascinating, and enlightening conversation. I'm very grateful to you all for sharing your expertise and your time with us this evening. Your informed analysis was very, very helpful. The League of Women Voters promotes political responsibility through informed and active participation in government. Going forward, we all have work to do now in helping to make policy. The League is a membership organization. We would be happy to welcome those who are not already members to join us. And we would value your support in presenting these and other programming. Please visit our website, lwvpdx.org. Check the membership and donor information there. And for the first time, the League of Women Voters of Portland will participate in Giving Tuesday on December 1st. We've put together a great program. You should tune in and have a look at it. This is Debbie Kay, President of the League of Women Voters of Portland. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. I wish you a fulfilling Thanksgiving holiday. Please keep well and stay strong. Thank you.